Hey everybody, welcome to a special Halloween edition of Friends Friday. It's an exciting time and it's crazy that we're almost to November and nearing the end of 2025, which is bizarre to me how fast time goes. But we appreciate you taking time to join us today. I hope you guys are having a good Friday and looking forward to a good weekend. Excited to have Jonathan Leitschuh on the cast today. Really excited. I've been looking forward to this conversation. Jonathan's an open source security vulnerability researcher, does a lot of cool stuff. We're going to dive into spooky vulnerabilities, in the supply chain, and talk all about those kinds of things, and then just kind of learn about maybe some tips and tricks on how to get started in security research and things like that. So Jonathan, thank you so much for taking time. I know we all have busy schedules, so really appreciate you taking that time to spend with us. But maybe for the audience, give a little bit of background on you and kind of like what you're excited about and doing and kind of your
Yeah.
professional realm. So
Yeah. I am best known for a security vulnerability that I found in Zoom back in 2019 that let anybody hijack your webcam and join you to a video call without your permission. That made international news. At the time, I was the security lead at Gradle. There was only one security person at Gradle. I kind of found my way into the security realm by accident. I found my first security vulnerability and by accident, and it kind of just ran from there. From there, when Dan Kaminsky passed away, I was honored to become the first ever Dan Kaminsky Fellow. So I
oh
got to spend a year working on a personal project under Dan's name, which gave me an opportunity to do research automating fixing security vulnerabilities at scale, doing bulk pull request generation, which I spoke about at Black Hat and DEF CON. Since then, I've worked for the Linux Foundation, and I just, in general, done security research, open source. I've been involved in the Open Source Security Foundation. Securing open source has been a big thing for me. I was the first year that GitHub had their CodeQL query bug bounty program. I think I made the highest amount of anybody from that program. So I've really been focused on finding security vulnerabilities in open source, reporting vulnerabilities to open source maintainers and organizations. I wrote the Open Source Security Foundation Vulnerability Disclosure Working Group, created a disclosure policy for outgoing vulnerabilities, and I was one of the SIG leads for that. And so I have a lot of experience with vulnerability disclosure, how vulnerability disclosure goes poorly, working with open source maintainers, just across the gambit. So I
yeah.
have a lot of fun with this stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean it's that's why I've been looking forward to it, because like lots of, I mean, we could probably spend hours talking about stuff like, we'll spare the audience some of that some of that
Yeah.
time, but I mean, I'd love to kind of, from the security practitioner perspective, I think a lot of
Mm.
people kind of wonder, well, how do you get into like vulnerability research, vulnerability, bug bounty, what were like, one, how did you kind of get interested in it? You mentioned you kind of just kind of stumbled into it,
Yeah.
but I'm curious how you kind of like grew into it, and then maybe tips and tricks or I mean like
Yeah.
advice for people getting in, that might want to get into more of the bug bounty and open source research.
Yeah. For me, I'm a software engineer, so I went to Worcester Polytechnic Institute. I took one cybersecurity class while I was there, and I have a degree in robotics and computer science. I originally started out with a robotics degree, ended up adding the computer science degree, and then after I graduated, I listened to a lot of podcasts. I'm particularly a fan of Security Now by Steve Gibson and Leo Laporte on the Twit
Mhm.
network.
Yep.
I've been listening to that one for years. And I'd always aspired to be a security researcher. I thought it was like the title of security researcher always seemed like something like really cool to kind of carry. But I was a software engineer, and that was fine. And I actually stumbled into my first security vulnerability by accident. It was actually in the Gradle plugin portal, and it was the ability to hijack a dependency from anybody who had published a dependency. I could step and publish one version higher for and so if you were using wildcard versions to resolve your dependencies for your Gradle plugins, you were running my code instead of somebody else's.
Oh, that's so
Apparently,
yeah.
yeah. So classic namespace hijacking. Apparently, the Google team had reported it like a week before I had, but it was still fun.
Yeah.
Um, and uh, and so I that was my first and I realized, oh, like my knowledge of computer science is enough to just find vulnerabilities. I
Yeah.
know enough as a software engineer that I can find vulnerabilities, and so I started just digging. The Zoom vulnerability that I found that made international news was, I was just curious how Zoom how you could click a link in Zoom, how it open a web page, and then that web page would launch an open local application. And I'm like, how is this working? What is the chain of events that's happening here that makes this happen, and how is it done securely? And the answer is, well, it's making a local web request to a local host server on your machine, and it's not done securely. There's a vulnerability here. Any website on the internet can abuse this. And when you see that, you're like, now I've got to write an email.
Yeah.
And that wasn't like, I wasn't looking for a vulnerability. I was just like, how does this work? Right. Like I was like curious. So a combination of curiosity, a combination of security engineering background, and a realization that actually I know enough just with those two things, that I can start finding vulnerabilities. And the rest is
Yeah.
just kind of history from there. I'm also not huge on bug bounty programs. I prefer to see vulnerabilities getting fixed and downstream consumers protected.
Right.
And I have a personal sort of opinion that a lot of bug bounty programs are used to silence research at times. If it's a vulnerability in like a vendor SaaS, and the vendor can fix the SaaS tool, like great, like that's pretty solid. But it doesn't always mix well with the vulnerability disclosure that happens in open source, which usually requires a CVE assigned, or vulnerabilities that are in software that gets shipped to end customers, right? Because that usually requires that the downstream consumer apply an update. And
Right.
so that's really important to me, is making sure that that happens, because just fixing it's not enough if the downstream consumers don't get fixed.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So I'm curious. Before we shift gears, I'd like to dig in a couple more questions just on some advice with like getting into security research and things like that. How much patience does it take? Because I've done exploit writing, and I really enjoyed the exploit writing part. I think probably that's where most people like writing it. But like discovery of the vulnerabilities is really that's the needle in a haystack kind of thing. Like what's some of your tips and tricks for just finding vulnerabilities or just being patient, or like what kind of mentality do you have when you're like actually doing the research?
I've figured out that writing the disclosure for public consumption, when you're writing the disclosure to the maintainer, is a great way to make sure that you actually have something worth publishing. Because if I write something to a maintainer and then it takes 3 months for them to fix it, I'm not going to have a blog post worth publishing. I'm not going to write a blog post in 3 months. I'll write a blog post now that will not be able to get published for 3 months. And so that's one of the major things that I've learned is, when you're writing a disclosure to a maintainer or an organization, and you want to blog about it, you want to publish it, write the whole thing for public consumption initially before you give it to them, because then you'll have something worth publishing down the line that you don't need to edit, or you don't need to write from scratch. You can just edit it a little bit based upon how they fix things. That's been the big thing. One of the things I've learned really early on is the importance of a disclosure policy. For many years, I used Google's disclosure policy.
Mhm.
I've had a lot of first-time security researchers come to me and been like, the vendor's not fixing the thing. And I'm like, do you have a disclosure policy? And they're like, no. And I'm like, well, you can add it now, but you're probably like, you're if you don't have the stick of this is going to get disclosed, a lot of vendors will sit on things for a very long time.
Yeah.
And so uh, I think that things need to get fixed. I think it's important that we apply pressure to vendors to get things fixed. And so I make sure that I always include a disclosure policy. That's why I wrote. I used to use Google's disclosure policy as my own. I just pulled the Google Project Zero policy off their website and linked to it in when I was doing disclosures. I've since co-authored the Open Source Security Foundation's disclosure policy, which is more targeting disclosures that are going to be involving open source maintainers. So there's like we've added additional language in there and try to make it as clear as possible around like what the timelines are. We've thought through things like understanding that certain vendors or certain maintainers may be on holiday in Europe for a long period of time. But one of the things that I've found personally working with Google's policy is there was not traditionally a caveat or call out for what if the maintainer doesn't respond, right?
Right.
And that's frequently you'll disclose a vulnerability and the maintainer will not respond. And it doesn't make sense to sit on a vulnerability disclosure for 90 days if you have an unresponsive maintainer. And
Hmm.
so the open source security vulnerability disclosure policy has a soft deadline of 21 days and a hard deadline of 35 days, where if the maintainer doesn't respond, you then have the right to just completely disclose at that point. So you have an early out, where you can just disclose because the maintainer either didn't respond or didn't confirm they were intending to fix it. Right?
Yeah.
If they're not articulating, yes, we do think this is a vulnerability, yes, we are going to fix it, then why should you sit on it for 90 days? You can just go public with it at that point because it's not going to get fixed, right?
Right.
Um, I found a lot of frustration too and sort of annoyance with the CV program. Um, the CVs can take very long time to get assigned. MITRE is particularly complicated to work with respect to CV assignment. I have thought about becoming a CNA myself, and I've run into issues becoming a CNA. MITRE and the CV program does not necessarily love individual CNAs, especially in the security researcher individual CNAs. There's one other individual CNA. His name's Larry Cashdollar, and that was a trial. I'm going to be talking to one of the CNA routes about becoming a CNA. I was originally planning on becoming a CNA with another organization and doing like myself and another organization at the same time, but now I think I'm going to pursue this individually.
Yeah.
And that'll make it easier for me to get CV numbers when I'm not dealing with a vendor that is themselves a CNA.
Yeah.
The other thing you'll run into too is the complicated nature of CVE assignment when the vendor is a CNA and there's a disagreement around
Mhm.
whether or not the thing that you're reporting is a vulnerability or not. And that can add to just additional layers of all I want to do is see this get a CV number because downstream consumers are uh, not aware of this vulnerability. And the CV system is the system that we have developed collectively as this industry to define this process by which vulnerability information disseminates to downstream consumers. And
Yeah.
when you can't get a CV number, I mean, a lot of researchers will say, "Well, CV is not everything; just do disclosure." And I'm like, "Yes, but it's commonly the only way that true downstream consumers will actually get information about vulnerabilities and whether or not they need to fix it adequately. Like it's a risk that the industry is aware of, and if you don't have your vulnerability in the machine of things that people should be aware of, people don't action on it."
Hmm. So I mean, like, it's interesting. I mean, I totally agree. I think that I've been in the space quite a bit of time. I've not really done a lot of disclosure, but been around folks that do, like yourself, that do it. And as a pen tester, so like I never really could get things assigned CVEs, like things that were definitely CVE worthy, but because we
Hmm.
were on private engagements, it's just like contracted as part of just a
Hmm.
pen test, right? So, but I'm curious, like, has it been easier or harder working with open source maintainers versus vendors? And then where do we go? I mean, like 90 days to me just feels like an insane amount of time,
Yep.
because of how fast things are going. I would think that even with like an open source, repository, it's hard to determine whether this is getting exploited in the wild, right? Because they're not,
I have no
you know,
visibility. Yeah.
yeah, like, and I would guess that an open source maintainer is not going to be monitoring for anything like that. I mean, at least a vendor, they're probably they may be able to start like looking at logs and stuff, right? Of like, okay, well, it's, depending on the type of vulnerability,
Yeah.
right? But like, to me, with how quickly exploits are going to be, continue to be written, and like when you disclose, I mean, you just have to assume now there is an exploit available at this point in
Yeah,
time.
yeah. I mean, I've disclosed things in software that I've seen is live on Shodan, right? One case in point is I have a vulnerability on the Kev list, the known exploited vulnerabilities list, CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities list. It was a vulnerability in Mongo Express, and it was a remote code execution vulnerability where they were parsing JSON as BSON, but they were using an eval like function.
Oh yeah.
And this thing traditionally was published in a way that was the servers were running in a way that was didn't have authentication, or the authentication I think was like admin for like the default auth. And so I went and saw that there was a bunch of these instances on Shodan that were connected to real life databases. And I was like, okay, this is not great. And then you disclose the CVE and you get it disclosed, and then very shortly you go back and look at those instances, and all the data has been wiped out, right? Like, and you're like, well, that's not great. Like,
Yeah.
and I think that was one of those cases where if I were to do it over again, I probably would have interacted with CISA or CertCC to try to get disclosure to the impacted Shodan instances a little bit more, because I think that they would have been in a better place to do that.
Uh,
Uh, yeah. But you were asking him, what was the more specific question that you had in
well,
there?
just kind of curious your opinion on the disclosure timelines and like
Oh
how many
yeah.
things are moving left, I guess.
Yeah. So Katie Mansuris and I have had a chat about this. And I'm Katie, I'm sorry if I butcher this, but my understanding was that when Katie, one of the original disclosure timelines that existed, one of the original was actually McAfee, I think, had a disclosure like deadline, and their disclosure deadline was 14 days, right? Um, uh, there was Rainforest Puppy, which had that was one of the original seminal disclosure policies. The disclosure policy was mostly didn't actually have a timeline. It was mostly like, we will stay quiet about this vulnerability as long as the vendor continues to engage with us. As soon as the vendor goes quiet, that's when we have the opportunity to disclose, right? If we're not hearing back from you, then why would we continue to hold this secret?
Yeah.
And so I don't think that Rainforest Puppy, which was one of the original disclosure policies, actually had a deadline on it. Since then, Google Project Zero has created their disclosure policy. They kind of set the norm around 90 days. I think that was around, my understanding, I could be completely wrong, but I think that my understanding around that is that gives 3 Microsoft Patch Tuesdays. And because Micro Project Zero was finding a lot of vulnerabilities in Microsoft software, and so that gives 3 Patch Tuesdays to occur during a disclosure window, such that, and then they also have a 14-day buffer as well, and that
Mhm.
gave the opportunity for Microsoft to get, because Microsoft was a traditionally very slow company to get vulnerabilities fixed, and I think that Google Project Zero has been really good around actually moving Microsoft to a place where they are actually fixing, and the rest of the industry has been really good about pushing Microsoft to moving them towards a pace where they are actually able to remediate vulnerabilities in a decently, 90 days is slow, but it's a lot faster than it used to be.
Sure, sure.
Um, um, and I agree that 90 days is a long time for something to be sitting out there. And I've seen vendors, I've seen open source maintainers. I mean, I've worked like the Jetty team sometimes, like you'll report something and it's out fixed immediately. And I'm like, I didn't even have time to verify your fix, right? Like, and then there's certain organizations where, like, I mean, Zoom, right? The reason that I went public with Zoom, the reason that I became famous is because I gave Zoom 90 days to fix a vulnerability. They didn't fix it adequately. I told them the fix that they had in their software was inadequate. They still shipped it anyways, and then something broke and it became vulnerable again. And I reported that to them. They're like, "That's a new vulnerability." I'm like, "No, it's not. It's the same vulnerability that I told you about. I told you that the fix that you were going to have for this is inadequate, and I'm going public with it." And and I was not going to wait around anymore for them to continue to try to fix this thing inadequately. And so it went public, and I honestly, I expected angry sysadmins, and instead I got coverage by Forbes, Wired, and NPR, TechCrunch, like, all the major tech industry journal, like, and they fixed it. And then on top of that, I think they ended up investing pretty heavily into their security after that event. Uh,
Because
I
you
mean,
said that was 2019, right? So
2019. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
that's when they went to, like,
Their investors weren't happy about it. I ended up subpoenaed in a federal class action lawsuit between Zoom and Zoom's investor over that many
oh
years later. I haven't actually talked about that, I don't think. But yeah, I got subpoenaed. that thankfully never went anywhere. Zoom ended up that whole thing went away, but like
Yeah.
it was like, I mean, people were not pleased about that whole thing.
Well, and that I mean, what you can talk about and what you can't, but like, I've known people where that is a very stressful place to be when
Yeah,
you're in that disclosure process. Like, I mean, I had some friends in the very, like, this would have been like kind of in the 05, 06 time frame when disclosure was very, like, there was not a lot of like collaboration between
yep.
security researchers back then, and lawyers be lawyers.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
so that could be, I mean, I'm sure there's lots of advice to be given to researchers on that kind of on that
This
in that case.
Disclose IO, which is one of the projects that was started by Casey John Ellis, who's the CTO of Bug Crowd.
Yeah, Casey very well.
Capture, yeah, so Casey's great. He created Disclose IO, and one of the open source lists that they've created is a list of security researcher threats, and they have a pretty large, extensive markdown list of all of the historical events that they've been able to capture where security researchers have been threatened by legal repercussions. I mean, they've included the coal fire incident where coal fire researchers were they're hired pen testers and they got
Yep,
arrested.
yep,
Cases like the reporter who was able to find a bunch of social security numbers for teachers in a website, and the governor came down on them. Right, like, I mean, but like this stuff is still a risk, thankfully a lot less of a risk than it was, but like, we've still seen good faith security researchers end up in the hands of law enforcement because of stuff like this. So I'm acutely aware that this is a risk. um the EFF can hopefully help you out if you end up in a problem, but like their resources are limited. There's also the security research, I can't remember the name of it. There's a fund that was created to create a fund for a legal support fund for security researchers that will offer grants to support your legal protection if you so need it. I don't think they've given out too much money yet. I think they've only supported like one or two people, but the money exists
hmm
whereby if you end up with like legal repercussions for your research, there are organizations you can reach out to and be like, "Hey, I need help," and they will hopefully help you in the right context.
yeah, and that's always, I think it's just been encouraging to see, one, how the community comes together, and then two, I do think that the general approach to security research has changed a lot over my
Yes.
career, right? And it
Yes.
is much
Yeah.
more collaborative, in general, because I think everybody
Yes.
recognizes, like, hey, if you're doing this in good faith and you're stating up front what your policy is for your disclosure, like, hey, I'm giving you time, like, people should be comfortable working around that, right? Working
Yeah.
with the researchers on that.
I have run into the issue consistently where organizations will have bug bounty programs, but they won't have vulnerability disclosure programs. And the problem that often arises with that is that bug bounty programs commonly carry a disclosure policy, which means, or a non-disclosure policy, which means if you disclose to an organization via this channel, they own the research and they have the right to refuse whether or not you are allowed to talk about that publicly at that point, even if they haven't paid you. The case in point was that I found. They had a non-disclosure policy on their bug bounty program. They would have paid, I think, $800 for the vulnerability that I found, $600 to $800 for the vulnerability that I found. And I read their policy after I'd reported the vulnerability to them by email, and I was like, I'm not going to agree to your non-disclosure policy. I think that this needs to get fixed. I think that your end downstream consumers need to be made aware of this vulnerability, especially if you don't fix it. And so I continued to communicate with Zoom via email. I was actually planning on going to Google Project, or I was planning on going to the Zero Day Initiative and reporting it to them if Zoom had not had a bug bounty program, because I was like, this is good research, and I was hoping to get paid for it. And I ended up burning that ability to do that, which is fine. Zoom ended up paying me a $10,000 bounty after I went public with it, just as like a, we made a mistake, thank you, sorry, which I really appreciated.
Yeah.
But I don't like getting myself into situations where my research is tied up in a non-disclosure policy. I I mostly think that a lot of the stuff needs to become public, not necessarily if it's in SaaS software, because the SaaS vendor can usually fix it themselves. I've kind of come around on that particular point. I was like, everything should be available to be free. But I find that a lot of bug bounty hunters who are specifically bug bounty hunters don't necessarily care. They're like, we're in it
Mhm.
for the money and we don't care about it getting disclosed or not. Um, I, as somebody who's looking at open source software and looking at software that ends up on end user machines, um, I think that bug bounty programs can frequently get used as a way to silence research and keep good research from becoming public. And basically, the line that I have is that it's buying researcher silence,
Mhm.
and I don't like that um, uh, being a part of that environment. And so I tend to opt for not agreeing to disclosure policies. I'll usually put in my first email or my first contact, this doesn't, I'm not agreeing to your disclosure policy. If you don't want my report, just close it, right? And I'll go public with it. That's your choice.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah. So yeah, and I think that's good. I mean, I think that's good perspective for people that can find themselves in this situation. What are the
Yeah.
things to be aware of and whatnot. With the little bit time we have left, I want to kind of dive in a little bit to like, you're obviously doing a lot of research on the open source
Hmm.
realm perspective and supply chain. I mean, like supply chain vulnerabilities have been rampant.
Hmm.
And it mostly. I mean, some significant issues, with open source software and repositories
Hmm.
getting, taken. What would be your tips like for like software engineers in terms of like, hey, what are the like the 1 to 3 most important things that they should focus on when selecting open source packages, like how to observe, monitor for safety and security, and then even like would you recommend them doing, companies doing their own security research on these, on the packages that they use, right?
Hmm. Um, I mean, the problem with any big corporate vendor who's building on open source is that they're consuming so much open source they don't even know what's in there, right? And then we're dealing with issues like slop squatting, where AI is generating packages that don't exist in ecos because like somebody's published some name in one package in one library in one ecosystem, and the AI generates a different, that same name but in a different language, and then somebody's typo squatted that or not type slop squatted that package, and now you're getting piece of malicious vulnerable software downloaded. Um, One of the cool tools that's been released, and it's free, it's freely available for anybody, is Socket Firewall, which can be used to block packages coming down that are malicious, that they've flagged as either malicious or recently
Mhm.
there's Step Security, which they have a GitHub Actions hardener that's freely available, that has two modes: an audit mode that will scan as you're running your GitHub Actions, it'll scan for what URLs that are being pulled from, and then a blocking mode where it'll then only allow your GitHub action to make requests to those domains again, so that if something gets maliciously gets added to your CI/CD pipeline, if it's trying to make a request outside of the set of domains that you initially whitelist or allow listed, it will be forbidden from making those requests outward again, which means that you're not going to have your credentials potentially leaked to some WhatsApp or whatever, like some threat actors feed or something like that. Um, those are sort of like simple hardening steps. I actually personally I've turned on audit mode on one of my most popular open source projects, but I never actually turned on the blocking mode. And you're reminding me to go do that for my own stuff. I
Yeah.
published an open source project called KT-Lint Gradle, which is probably one of the most popular Kotlin linting Gradle plugins out there. Well, there's one other one, but and it's not even security related. It's just something that I built when I was working for Plexi years ago, and it's one of those open source projects that continues to perpetuate and
Yeah.
run for years. um uh yeah, I mean, I think that we're writing so much software that assuming that any one of us is going to be able to get it right 100% is ludicrous.
Yeah.
I'm using I'm using Claude to write, you know vulnerability exploits, and I'm trusting it to just write code and be like, yeah, and I've also been one of those people that, like, you go on Stack Overflow and you're like, this command's not working. What do I need to fix? And you go on Stack Overflow, you Google the error, and it's like,
Yeah.
oh, install this package, right? Just run apt-get for this thing, it'll fix it. I'm
Yeah.
like, great, and then it fixes it, and I'm like, I'm good,
Yeah.
and like
Yeah.
so. What do we do there? I don't
Yeah.
know. Like, it's just the nature of all of us, right? Like, it's
Right.
we just want to get our software working. The biggest thing for me, like, I can't necessarily speak to how do we fix the supply chain attack things. One of the things that I think that is really important is that we, like, fix the insecure default thing in the industry, right?
Oh,
Like,
absolutely.
the reason that I install things, right? I want to be able to do apt-get install and just pull the thing down, but I want to make sure that thing should be secure by default when I pull
Right.
it down.
Yeah.
And because that's going to keep people from shooting themselves in the foot more frequently.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I think you brought up a lot of good points and things that I could ask a lot more questions on, but I
Yep.
think that, like, I think that that notion of zero trust is applicable in the software engineering realm.
Layers,
I mean, just you got
layers of
to,
protection.
right,
Yeah.
you just got to continue to be aware, understand, like, hey, you can't trust everything, like you mentioned, AI generated code versus open source code. I mean, we're bringing in and we're trying to, speed up the SDLC as much as we can. It's going to continue to present its own
Mhm.
its own demons, but yeah, I think that just awareness of the things that we can be doing, and also trying to continue to influence, right, this the
Yeah.
secure by default, making
Yeah.
sure the you're understanding what you're actually downloading from where, and secure trusted repositories, all those things, right?
There's been some push towards I mean, so there's things like salsa, there's salsa attestations, there's proving that your package came from where it is. Thankfully, more and more tools are integrating these attestations. NPM is making it so that you can only publish, like, they're locking down their publishing and making it harder for people to publish. Trying to prevent more of these, like, Shah Halud sort of style, like,
Right.
worm attacks. One of the I had a thought bounced out of my head. Uh, uh, we need to there are intentional efforts that are going on in the industry to try to make these things better. Like the Open Source Security Foundation has been a great source of this. Like, there's working groups like the Securing Software Repositories working group where we're trying to protect this stuff. One of the sort of big things that I have been concerned about for a long time is that most of the big major artifact servers in the industry, right? NPM, RubyGem, PyPy,
Yeah.
up until recently, many of these major artifact servers, because they've never gone through, like, a buying process, they never had a pen test done because they
uh,
don't need SOC compliance. They don't need any of these things.
right.
Like, I mean, when you're selling a product, companies are not going to buy it from you unless you've got a pen test done, unless you have a SOC compliance, right? But these major artifact servers that are freely available, there's never gone through an acquisition process. They never, like, nobody's been like, we're not going to buy this thing.
Right.
It just gets integrated into your supply chain.
And
And
everyone uses
so, yeah,
it.
and everybody uses it, and it's part of your entire major supply chain. And there are a couple of them out there that I know have never had a pen test done.
Uh-huh.
Like, bare level, like, we've never had a pen test done on major supply chain components that are being used in the SDLC's life cycle for everybody,
Yeah.
right? That's insane. I think that's insane.
Well,
But
I mean, and that just kind of shows how interconnected, and I mean, the things like AWS US East going down, kind of, these are the kinds of things that show us, like, oh man, like, there's just some things that are so woven in that people
Mhm,
we've got to continue to stay vigilant. So yeah,
mhm.
it's fascinating. So, well, John, we've reached the end of our time. I was super engaged. I could go on for hours talking about this stuff.
Same.
Hopefully the audience was stuck with us. But thank you again. Tell us about how to find you, or find your research, or
Yeah,
anything else that you'd like to share about what you're working on.
yeah. So I have a Medium. If you want to Google me, Jonathan Leitschuh Medium, you can find me on LinkedIn. Shoot me when you try to connect me on LinkedIn, send me a message how you heard about me. Mention the podcast. Yeah, yeah, those are the major ways to get in touch with me. I do X, but not as frequently as I used to. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thanks again, Jonathan. Really appreciate the time. This was fascinating. Great conversation. Thanks for all the work that you're doing. I love talking to security researchers and really support that in our industry. And yeah, so if you guys have questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. And with that, I wish you all a very happy and safe Halloween, and we
Yep.
will catch you next time. Thanks again, Jonathan, and we'll catch everybody on the next episode.